The city of San Andreas stretched across the California coastline like a shimmering jewel, basking in the warmth of the late afternoon sun. Skyscrapers gleamed with glass reflections, the highways pulsed with their endless traffic, and the beaches hummed with life. Children building sandcastles, surfers chasing their last ride before dusk, and tourists snapping photos with phones lifted toward the horizon. To the casual observer, everything looked perfect. The ocean lapped gently against the shore. A salty breeze carried laughter from the boardwalk, and street vendors sold roasted corn, tacos, and ice-cold drinks to passers-by. But beneath that calm, deep under the earth's crust, something ancient and powerful was stirring. Subtle signs of trouble. For days, there had been warnings. Small tremors rippled through the city, rattling windows and causing chandeliers to sway in elegant homes. Most residents shrugged them off. California lived with earthquakes the way other places live with storms. To the locals, a little shake was nothing to panic about. But in the offices of the San Andreas Geological Institute, the mood was far less casual. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a seismologist with 30 years of experience, watched the readings from her monitors with growing unease. The instruments didn't just show aftershocks. They showed a steady increase in tectonic pressure building along the fault line. "It's not just an earthquake we're facing," she murmured to her assistant. "Something far worse could be coming. If the seabed shifts, we could be looking at a tsunami." Her warnings filtered to city officials, but bureaucracy is slow. A few press conferences, a handful of evacuation advisories that most ignored, and then life carried on. Businesses didn't want to close early. Tourists didn't want to cut their vacations short, and families didn't want to leave their homes over what-ifs. The sea, however, was already whispering its intentions. A strange ocean. On the beaches, surfers noticed unusual swells, a strange energy rippling beneath their boards. Fishermen spoke of odd catches and currents behaving unpredictably. At first, it was just talk. Stories swapped over beers, shrugged off as the quirks of the sea. But then came something undeniable. In the early evening, as the sun began to lower, the ocean began to retreat. Slowly at first, so subtle that children chasing the tide didn't notice. Then, with unmistakable urgency, the water was sucked backward, exposing the seabed where waves had always covered it. Boats leaned awkwardly in the shallows. Shellfish clung to rocks now steaming in open air. Tourists squealed with delight, running to collect shells and take photos on the new beach. But the old fishermen turned pale. They'd seen this before, or at least heard of it. The ocean was not giving a gift. It was drawing its breath before unleashing fury. Introducing the heroes. Elsewhere in the city, the people who would become its defenders were going about their ordinary lives. Captain Marcus Steele, a helicopter pilot for the Coast Guard, was preparing to head home after a long shift. He had saved dozens of lives in his career, but nothing had prepared him for what was coming. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a firefighter with a reputation for fearless rescues, was at the station polishing equipment. She lived for adrenaline, but tonight's test would push her beyond limits. Jason Morales, a paramedic, was driving his ambulance back to base, humming along to a rock song, unaware that within an hour he would be performing triage in the middle of a drowned city. And then there was Lena Harper, a young mother of two, who had taken her kids to the pier for ice cream. She was no rescuer by trade, but fate would demand that she become one in ways she never imagined. These people didn't know each other yet, but disaster has a way of binding strangers together into something greater. The final normal moments. At the pier, Lena laughed as her children dripped ice cream onto their clothes. Couples strolled hand in hand, oblivious of the warning sirens that began faintly wailing in the distance. Tourists thought it was part of the city's background noise. San Andreas was always alive with alarms, sirens, and chatter. Downtown, Marcus Steele stopped in the parking lot outside his Coast Guard base. Staring at the horizon, he noticed the waterline vanishing. His instincts screamed at him. Within seconds, he was sprinting back inside, shouting for his crew to ready the helicopters. Sarah Kim's fire station phones lit up. Call after call came in. First confusion, then panic. Report to the ocean retreating, of strange booming sounds from the seabed. She snapped her helmet on and barked orders, adrenaline flooding her system. Jason Morales felt his ambulance vibrate, not from the engine, but from something deeper. A tremor rattled the streets, making car alarms blare. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as traffic around him froze. And then the sirens across the entire city came alive, urgent howling impossible to ignore. The wave approaches. Far out at sea, invisible to the naked eye but captured on instruments, the tectonic plates had shifted. The sudden release of energy displaced an unimaginable volume of water, sending it racing toward shore at terrifying speed. From the coast, it looked like a dark line on the horizon, but it grew, rising higher, building into a wall of water that dwarfed skyscrapers. On the beach, people finally realized the danger. Some screamed, some ran, others froze, too stunned to move. The first to grasp what was happening were the locals, sprinting for higher ground, dragging strangers along with them. The city of San Andreas, vibrant and unprepared, was seconds away from catastrophe. And in those final moments before the wave struck, there was silence, a heavy, surreal quiet blanketing the coast, broken only by the distant thunder of the sea. Birds fled inland, dogs howled, children clung to their parents. Then the wall of water hit. It struck with the force of an asteroid, swallowing the shoreline in an instant. The boardwalk shattered like matchsticks. Cars and buses were tossed like toys. Entire blocks disappeared under churning. Debris filled chaos. The city that had been alive with laughter just minutes before was now screaming, drowning, fighting for survival. And this was only the beginning. The wave came with a roar that drowned out every siren, every scream, every prayer. It was not just water. It was a moving mountain, a wall of liquid steel that tore into San Andreas with merciless force. The first impact. The beachfront was the first to vanish. The once bustling boardwalk splintered as planks snapped and flew like shrapnel. Amusement rides, bright with neon lights just minutes earlier, were swept away in an instant. The Ferris wheel crumpled as a surge slammed into its steel frame, carrying twisted metal inland like a battering ram. People ran, but the wave was faster. It lifted cars, buses, and trucks as though they were nothing more than paper boats, smashing them into buildings. Glass shattered in office towers. Storefronts exploded outward as water punched through with unstoppable momentum. Those caught on the streets were swept off their feet, pulled into a violent current choked with debris. A mother screamed as she clutched her baby above her head, vanishing in the frothing chaos. A man clung to a streetlight until the pole itself bent and disappeared. San Andreas had become an ocean in less than 60 seconds. The city in chaos. From above, Marcus Steele's helicopter battled hurricane-force winds, created by the wave's impact. The city he knew was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods looked like toy blocks knocked over by a careless child. He and his crew leaned out, scanning the maelstrom for survivors. Every second revealed another life in peril. People clinging to rooftops, others trapped in floating cars, children screaming for their parents. On the ground, Sarah Kim fought her way through chest-deep water with her crew. Fire trucks had been overturned, hoses ripped apart, but the firefighters moved anyway, carrying ropes, ladders, and axes. "Over here!" she shouted, pointing to a car pinned against a building. A child inside beat against the window, water rising around her. Jason Morales' ambulance had been swept sideways into a storefront. Crawling out of the wreckage, he was soaked, bleeding but alive. Around him, the injured stumbled through waist-deep torrents. His instincts took over. He began pulling people onto floating debris, fashioning makeshift stretchers, turning survivors into helpers. Every second mattered, and there was no time to think about himself. Split-second decisions. The tsunami was not a single wave, but a series. After the first surge receded slightly, it dragged everything back with it. People, vehicles, entire buildings grinding against one another in the current. Those who had survived the first strike faced an impossible choice. Climb higher or be pulled out to sea. On the pier, or what remained of it, Lena Harper grabbed both her children and ran for the stairs of a nearby hotel. The lower floors were already flooding, but she forced her kids up, step by step, heart pounding. Behind her, strangers shouted for help, some making it inside, others swept away before they could reach safety. In the distance, The second wave was building, taller than the first. The ocean had not finished its assault. Moments of courage amid the devastation. Sparks of heroism flared. A teenage boy tied bedsheets together to lower trapped neighbors from a burning rooftop. An elderly fisherman waded into the surge to pull strangers onto his boat, ignoring the risk of capsizing. Sarah Kim and her crew smashed the car window with axes, dragging the little girl out seconds before the vehicle was crushed against a collapsing wall. Jason Morales used the door as a makeshift raft, loading the injured onto it and pushing them toward higher ground. Even as destruction raged around them, the will to fight, to save, to resist the wave, burned bright. The city falls silent. By the time the second wave hit, the city's power grid had failed. Darkness spread as buildings lost electricity. Streetlights flickered out, and the once lively skyline went black. The only illumination came from fires sparked by ruptured gas lines and the red strobe of emergency beacons. The water carved its way deeper into the city, swallowing parks, highways, and neighborhoods. Bridges collapsed. Subways flooded. The city's proud infrastructure buckled under the relentless force of nature. When the second surge finally slowed, San Andreas was no longer recognizable. It was a broken, half-submerged labyrinth where cries for help echoed into the night. Survivors huddled on rooftops, clinging to each other, staring out over a drowned world. The tsunami had struck with fury, but this was only the start of the ordeal. The true test, the fight to survive and rescue others, was about to begin. The wave had passed, but San Andreas was still drowning. Entire districts were submerged, and what remained above water looked more like ruins in a city. Fires burned on rooftops. Sirens wailed intermittently, many now broken and distorted by water damage. The cries of survivors carried across the flood, desperate and raw. But amid that devastation, something powerful stirred. Rescue. Mobilizing the heroes. Captain Marcus Steele's helicopter hovered low over a collapsed freeway, its spotlight cutting across the chaos. His crew dropped ropes, hauling up survivors clinging to overturned vehicles. Marcus's headset crackled with frantic calls from command. Dozens of neighborhoods unreachable, hundreds trapped. The city's emergency response systems were overwhelmed, communications fractured. "Forget waiting for orders," Marcus growled. "We move now." His team agreed instantly. Training was vital, but instinct humanity drove them. Every minute lost meant lives swallowed by the rising waters. On the ground, Sarah Kim gathered what remained of her fire crew. Their trucks were gone, their gear soaked, but their resolve hadn't drowned. They scavenged ropes, ladders, even crowbars from half-flooded hardware stores. "We don't stop," Sarah told them. "Not until everyone's out of this hell." Jason Morales, his paramedic uniform shredded and soaked, had already turned survivors into a triage unit. He directed volunteers to build stretchers from doors, used tablecloths as bandages, and wrenched open medical supply cabinets from abandoned pharmacies. He was exhausted, but adrenaline kept him moving. People needed him, injured, burned, gasping for breath, and he refused to let them down. Acts of bravery. The first hours after the tsunami became a blur of frantic rescues. Marcus's helicopter winched families off rooftops as flames licked closer. One man refused to board until he had lifted his unconscious wife into the harness first. Sarah Kim led her team through a half-submerged mall, smashing glass to free people trapped inside. The water was rising, mannequins floating eerily alongside the living, but they pushed through until every survivor was out. Jason Morales swam into an overturned bus, pulling out screaming children as the wreck groaned and shifted dangerously beneath the current. He emerged coughing, holding two at once, his arms shaking but unyielding. Each rescue carried risk. Helicopters flew dangerously low, nearly colliding with debris. Firefighters balanced across crumbling rooftops. Civilians turned heroes braved waters filled with jagged glass and live wires. But hesitation meant death, and hesitation was a luxury no one could afford. The human spirit. What made this mission extraordinary wasn't just the professionals. It was the ordinary people who refused to stand by. Strangers linked arms to form human chains, pulling each other from raging currents. A restaurant owner broke into his own freezer to feed displaced families. A mechanic hot-wired a boat abandoned on the dock and ferried people to safety until it finally capsized. Lena Harper, the young mother who had fled with her children, became part of that effort. After ensuring her kids were safe on a hotel rooftop, she returned again and again, helping strangers climb the stairs, wrapping blankets around shivering children, refusing to rest. In her eyes, fear had transformed into fierce determination, the struggle against nature. The city itself fought against their efforts. Flooded streets had sinkholes that swallowed entire rescue vehicles. Fires leapt from building to building as ruptured gas lines fed the inferno. Aftershocks rattled the ground, toppling weakened structures onto already fragile survivors. In one harrowing moment, Sarah Kim and her crew barely escaped when a collapsing parking garage sent a cascade of cars into the flood like deadly projectiles. She dove under an overturned SUV, dragging 2 survivors with her. Teeth gritted as debris thundered past overhead. Marcus's helicopter nearly lost power when flying through smoke. For a heart-stopping moment, the rotors clipped a rooftop antenna. His co-pilot swore, but Marcus steadied the controls, heart pounding, and went back for another pass. There was no room for mistakes. A fragile hope. Hours passed like minutes. The night was filled with the buzz of helicopters, the crackle of radios, the crash of collapsing buildings, and the endless cries for help. But slowly and possibly, rescue succeeded. People were pulled from submerged cars, lifted off rooftops, guided through dark stairwells toward safety. By dawn, survivors huddled in makeshift shelters on higher ground, schools, stadiums, and half-standing churches. Exhausted, wet, shivering, they held their loved ones close. Many had lost everything, but they were alive. For Marcus, Sarah, Jason, Lena, and countless others, there was no rest yet. The mission wasn't over. Too many were still missing, too many still trapped. The city was wounded but not defeated. The rescue mission had only just begun, and would test every ounce of strength, courage, and humanity they possessed. When dawn finally broke over San Andreas, the city was unrecognizable. Where streets once bustled with traffic, there were rivers of black water reflecting the pale morning light. Skyscrapers stood like broken teeth, jagged and scarred, while neighborhoods that thrived just a day before now lay beneath waves of silence. The destruction was almost too vast to comprehend. But amid the ruins, life endured. The first glimmers of survival. On a school rooftop, hundreds of survivors huddled together, wrapped in blankets distributed by rescuers. Children cried softly into their parents' arms, their eyes wide with shock. Some people sat in stunned silence, unable to process the devastation below. Yet even in that silence, a powerful truth lingered. They had made it through the night. Helicopters thudded overhead, ferrying the injured to makeshift medical camps. Coast Guard ships circled the flooded outskirts, picking up those stranded on fragments of debris. From every direction, rescue squads continued to emerge, exhausted but relentless. They had worked without pause for nearly 24 hours, but the mission wasn't over. Jason Morales crouched beside a row of stretchers in a triage camp. His uniform was torn, his hands blistered, his body trembling with fatigue. But as he adjusted in 4-line for an elderly woman and pressed gauze to a young man's wounds, he managed a tired smile. Around him, volunteers passed out bottled water and granola bars scavenged from stores. Humanity, battered though it was, still found a way to care. Facing loss, finding strength, the cost of survival was everywhere. Families scanned lists of names posted by emergency workers, desperate to find loved ones. When reunions happened, they were raw and tearful, a reminder of why they had fought so hard to endure. But many lists ended with the word missing. Sarah Kim stood outside what was once a hospital, now half submerged, as her crew carried out the last of the patients who had survived the night. She closed her eyes, inhaled the smoky air, and forced herself to focus on the living, not the lost. For every life they hadn't been able to save, there were dozens more who had been pulled from the water because they hadn't given up. That balance gave her the strength to keep going. Captain Marcus Steele finally landed his helicopter after nearly 12 hours in the air. His crew staggered out, drained and hollow-eyed, but the sight of the survivors they had lifted from rooftops gave him pride. He had seen cities burn, Storms rage and people crumble, but never had he seen such raw courage in ordinary citizens. Ordinary heroes. What defined San Andreas now wasn't the wreckage of steel and concrete, but the strength of its people. Strangers had saved strangers. Children had comforted adults. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, and grandparents had all played a part in defying the tsunami's attempt to erase them. Lena Harper stood on the rooftop of the hotel where she had sheltered with her children. Around her, she had organized survivors into small groups, some gathering supplies, others building makeshift rafts, others caring for the injured. She had never been a leader before, but catastrophe had forged her into one. Her children clung to her, eyes tired but proud. In them, she saw the future that must be protected at all costs, the beginning of rebuilding. By the second day, aid began to arrive from neighboring cities and states. Military convoys pushed through wrecked highways. Relief helicopters dropped crates of food, medicine, and clean water. Engineers worked tirelessly to shut down gas leaks, stabilize power grids, and clear safe zones. San Andreas would not be rebuilt overnight. It would take years. Homes were gone, schools destroyed, businesses lost forever. But the survivors didn't talk about what they had lost as much as what they still had: each other. At a stadium converted into a massive shelter, thousands of people gathered. Some wept, some prayed, some simply sat and stared at the horizon. And yet, slowly, conversations began. People shared stories of how they had survived, of the strangers who had pulled them from the water, of the loved ones they still held close. In those conversations, hope was reborn, a city transformed. Disaster had scarred San Andreas, but it also revealed something indestructible: unity. From the pilots who braved the storm, to the firefighters who smashed through walls, to the civilians who became rescuers without hesitation, the spirit of survival burned brighter than the floodwaters. In the end, San Andreas would not be remembered only for the wave that nearly destroyed it, but for the people who refused to let it fall. The ruins were real. The grief was heavy. But in the eyes of those who survived, there was a new determination, an oath whispered silently across rooftops and shelters: we will rise again. And so, amid the devastation, hope took root, stronger than any wave.